was looking for a cathedral to draw. Something Gothic, impressive, with good architectural details for reference material. That's when I found Salisbury Cathedral and started reading about its history. And immediately, something felt wrong. We've all heard the story. The one they tell you in school, in documentaries, and history books. How medieval people, with nothing but ropes and pulleys, built these impossible stone giants that reached toward the heavens. It's a nice story. A story of faith, determination, and human achievement. But what if the official history has serious gaps that nobody wants to talk about? What if, when you actually do the math, the story starts to fall apart? Here at Salisbury Cathedral hangs the very machine they say built this place. A machine they proudly show to tourists as proof of medieval engineering genius. Look at this, a treadwheel crane, basically a giant wooden wheel with rope powered by men walking inside it like hamsters. This is what they point to on the cathedral tour as evidence of how this place was built. My BS detector went off instantly. The technology and the achievement felt centuries apart. Let me tell you about this crane, this wooden wheel hanging here. According to the cathedral's own information, this crane is from the 14th century. It was used to build the spire, the top 404 feet of this structure, sometime after the year 1300. This crane can lift a maximum of 2 tons to a height of 88 feet. Now look at what they're telling us about the main cathedral. The main structure, everything below the spire, was supposedly built between 1220 and 1258. 38 years. The nave vaulting is 82 feet high. The pillars are massive blocks of Purbeck marble weighing several tons each. The precision stonework, the geometric perfection, the sheer scale of it all built without this crane. So here's my question. If they needed this advanced 14th century lifting technology to add the spire, then what did they use to build the much heavier, more complex main structure before this technology existed? A more primitive version? Now, some will say they had primitive versions of this crane. Okay. Show me where. Show me the evidence that technology existed in 1220 that could lift 5-ton marble pillars 80 feet in the air. The spire reaches 404 feet. That's a 40-story building. Historians say they used ramps and scaffolding. Okay? Show me the engineering calculations for a wooden ramp that can support multi-ton stones at a 40-degree angle for 400 feet. Show me the rope that won't snap under 5 tons of load being pulled up 40 stories. Show me the archaeological evidence of the massive timber infrastructure this would require. So I started looking for evidence of the construction tools. Not just what historians say was used, but what actually left marks on the stone. Look at this stonework. Look at the precision of these cuts, the uniform depth of these carved details, the perfect fit of these joints. These are the tools they claim were available in 1220. Hand chisels made of iron, wooden mallets, hand saws, rope, and wooden pulleys. Now, look at this again. Show me the chisel marks. Show me the inconsistencies you'd expect from hand tools. Show me the learning curve, the early mistakes, the refinements over time. Because what I see here looks like it was cut with precision we didn't achieve until much, much later. Salisbury Cathedral has no workforce records. No payment ledgers, no construction logs, no master mason names for certain. The master mason was either Nicholas of Ely or Robert of Ely, but Elias de Dereham is the name most widely associated with the construction of the cathedral. He, however, is a medieval mystery figure, and the cathedral was supposedly built faster and more uniformly than any other major English cathedral. Wouldn't you want to pass on that knowledge, relevant documentation and architectural plans to the next generation of builders? What we do have are records from after construction, such as maintenance logs from 1464 onwards, repair expenses, and bell ringing payments. But from the 38 years when 70,000 tons of stone were supposedly quarried, transported, shaped, and set in place, nothing. Salisbury's own archives, the Liber Evidentiarum C, was compiled chiefly in the latter part of the 13th century, so that's 50 plus years after the supposed 1220 start date. The earliest construction-related document is a 1227 charter mentioning where the king laid the first stone, 7 years after construction supposedly began. When historians tell you about the 400 workers, the construction methods, and the techniques used, they're making estimates, educated guesses based on what happened elsewhere. They're not citing Salisbury's own records. Let's do the math on what they're actually claiming. 70,000 tons of stone, built in 38 years. That's a little over 1,840 tons per year, which divided by 250 working days, accounting for Sundays, winters, and the dozens of medieval holy days when no work happened, gives us 7.4 tons of stone per day, every single working day, for nearly 4 decades. Now, the official records say around 400 workers built this cathedral, so let's see what that means per person. 7.4 tons divided by 400 workers equals 37 pounds of finished stone per worker per day. And honestly, that doesn't sound impossible, but here's where the official story falls apart. That 37 pounds, that's finished stone. Stone that's already been installed in the cathedral. Stone that's been shaped, carved, and lifted into place. To get 37 pounds of finished stone, you first need to quarry significantly more raw stone, because hand quarrying isn't precise. You're splitting rock with chisels and hammers, and you're losing 40 to 60% of your material just getting it out of the ground. With a 50% waste rate, which is actually optimistic for medieval quarrying, you need to extract 74 pounds of raw stone to end up with 37 pounds of usable material. With 60% waste, you're looking at 93 pounds. So now we're not talking about moving 37 pounds anymore. We're talking about each worker quarrying somewhere between 75 and 95 pounds of raw stone every day by hand with a chisel and hammer, then transporting it 6 miles by ox cart over medieval roads, then precisely cutting it to specification by hand with those same primitive tools, then lifting it up to 80 feet in the air using only rope, wood, and human muscle, then setting it permanently in place with mortar. And if it's a decorative element, and this cathedral has thousands of them, carving intricate details into it. 75 to 95 pounds of stone through that entire process, per worker, every working day for 38 years. No major injuries slowing production, no funding gaps halting work, no design changes requiring rework, no material shortages, no bad weather beyond what's already accounted for, no mistakes, just perfect, uninterrupted efficiency for nearly 4 decades. Does that sound possible with hammers and chisels, or does it sound like something's missing from the story we've been told? They tell us 400 workers built this cathedral over 38 years. That's 3.8 million person days of labor. Let me put that in perspective. 400 people working every day for 38 years. They need to eat 3 meals a day, so that's 41 million meals. Where's the kitchen that prepared 41 million meals. Where's the bakery? The mill? The granary? Where's the housing for 400 workers? Where's the latrine? Where are the garbage heaps from 38 years of continuous habitation? Now, the archaeological excavation did find 13th century workshop remains, which sounds like proof, until you realize they are beneath the bell tower foundation, which means they existed before the tower was built, not while it was being built. So, where did those workers actually live during construction for 38 years? That's a question without an answer. But here's something that makes this even more impossible. In 1220, Salisbury as we know it didn't exist yet. The city was founded in 1217, just 3 years before construction supposedly began. It received its royal charter in 1227, 7 years into construction. So in 1220, when this massive cathedral project supposedly started, Salisbury was an empty field, a building site, nothing more. There was no city, no infrastructure, no existing roads, no housing, no marketplace, no granaries, no mills, no bakeries, and no support infrastructure whatsoever. Yet somehow 400 workers showed up to an empty field and immediately began the most ambitious construction project in English history. Where did they sleep that first year? Where did they get food before the city had markets? How did they transport 7.4 tons of stone per day before the roads even existed? This isn't just missing documentation. This is missing everything. So let me get this straight. In 1220, you arrive at an empty field with 400 workers and start building one of the greatest cathedrals in Europe. But before you can build the cathedral, you need the infrastructure. Roads capable of moving 7.4 tons of stone daily. Housing for 400 workers. Kitchens and cooking facilities for 1,200 meals per day. Sanitation systems. Fresh water supply for hundreds of people. Storage buildings for tools, materials, and food. Workshops for cutting and shaping stone. Stables for dozens of oxen. Blacksmith forges for tool repair. And administrative buildings for organizing the work. Who built all of that? If you need 400 workers to build a cathedral, how many workers did you need to build the infrastructure to support those 400 workers? Another 200? Maybe 300? So now you're talking about 600 to 700 people working in an empty field in 1220. Where did they live while building the worker housing? Historians point to worker settlements at other cathedral sites. But Canterbury had a town, York had a town, and Westminster was in London. Salisbury didn't have a town yet. They moved the cathedral from Old Sarum to an empty water meadow in 1220. When we build a major construction project today, a stadium, a skyscraper, or a bridge, we spend years on site preparation, building access roads, temporary facilities, worker housing or transport systems, and supply chain logistics. And we have trucks, cranes, power tools, computers, and modern logistics. They had ox carts and rope. So either they accomplished the impossible with no evidence, or the timeline we're being told is fundamentally wrong. But here's an even bigger question. Where did these 400 workers come from in the first place? In 1220, England had a population of roughly 3.5 million people. Let that sink in for a moment. The entire country, from Cornwall to Northumberland, had fewer people than modern-day Los Angeles. And of those 3.5 million, 90% were agricultural workers, tied to manorial estates under feudal law. They couldn't just leave to work elsewhere. They were legally bound to the land. That leaves maybe 350,000 people as potential skilled craftsmen for the entire country. But skilled craftsmen didn't mean cathedral builders. Every village needed blacksmiths, carpenters, millers, tanners, brewers, bakers, weavers, dyers, cobblers, wheelwrights, and coopers. These weren't optional luxuries. These were the people who kept medieval society functioning. So, the actual pool of highly skilled stonemasons and carvers available for cathedral work. Maybe a few thousand in all of England. Around 1220, multiple cathedrals were built in Europe. Salisbury needed 400 workers, but all of the other cathedrals in England and Europe also needed hundreds of skilled workers, plus dozens of smaller churches, castles, manor houses, and fortifications across England and Europe were all supposedly happening at once, all competing for the same tiny pool of skilled labor. And remember, in 1220, most people couldn't read or write. There were no formal guild training systems yet established, and no standardized measurements between regions. Communication between building sites took weeks or months. Travel was dangerous and expensive. Where did they train? Master masons supposedly passed knowledge through apprenticeships, but creating a skilled mason took 7 to 10 years of training. To have 400 skilled masons available in 1220, you'd need to have started training them around 1210. Where are the records of these massive training programs? Where are the workshops that produced hundreds of trained craftsmen simultaneously? And here's something else that doesn't make sense. A mason starting work on Salisbury in 1220 at age 25 would be 63 years old when it finished in 1258. Their entire working life spent on one building. Why would hundreds of skilled craftsmen commit their entire careers to a single project? What about their families and their own economic security? When the cathedral was finished, where did they go? There should be records of 400 skilled masons moving on to new projects after 1258, letters of recommendation, payment records at their next jobs. We have none of that. It's like 400 people just vanished into thin air the moment Salisbury was complete. This isn't the first cathedral in Salisbury. 2 miles from here, at a place called Old Sarum, there's another cathedral. Or rather, there was one. It was built in 1091 and stood for 129 years. They tell us they moved because of problems with water supply, stormy weather, and difficult relations with the castle guards. But look at Old Sarum. It's on a defensive hill fort that's been occupied since the Iron Age. Romans built on it. Normans built a cathedral and a castle there. After 129 years of continuous occupation, they suddenly decided it was uninhabitable. Or did they have their eye on something? Something already here in the valley? I don't think Salisbury Cathedral was built from scratch in 1220. I think it's older. Much, much older. Now I know what you're thinking, but Salisbury is pure early English Gothic style. If it's older, why isn't it Romanesque like earlier Norman buildings? Here's my answer. What if what we're seeing is a Gothic renovation of an older structural core? Think of it like renovating a house. You keep the foundation, the load-bearing walls, the basic structure, but you completely transform the appearance. new facades, modern interiors, and contemporary design elements. That's what I think happened here. The core structure, the foundations, the main walls, the basic floor plan, could be centuries older. The Gothic style elements, the decorative work that makes it look 13th century, were added during that 1220 to 1258 period. But there's something else, something that makes the official timeline even harder to believe. They tell us 10,000 tons of Purbeck marble was quarried from Dorset and transported to Salisbury between 1220 and 1258. Now, Purbeck marble isn't actually marble. It's a highly polished limestone containing freshwater snail fossils from the Cretaceous period. Beautiful, decorative, and incredibly difficult to work with. To create those slender decorative columns you see throughout the cathedral, the stone had to be quarried horizontally from specific geological beds. Not vertically, but horizontally. This requires precise geological knowledge of where the right beds are located, sophisticated quarrying techniques to extract stones sideways, careful transportation of delicate, pre-shaped pieces over 40-plus miles, and on-site finishing and polishing to achieve that mirror-like surface. This isn't just hauling blocks of stone and chipping them into shape. This is precision geological mining, complex logistics, and master-level stone finishing. And they accomplished this in 1220, with ox carts, hand tools, and rope. This is Guédelon Castle in France. Since 1997, that's 28 years ago, they've been building a 13th century castle using authentic medieval tools, techniques, and materials. Real medieval methods, real craftspeople, real stone. Look at this stonework. Look at the roughness, the irregularities, the visible tool marks. Now look at Salisbury's Purbeck marble columns again. Does this look like it was built with the same technology? The same tools? The same methods? Because if Guédelon represents what medieval tools can actually produce, then what does Salisbury represent? Let me show you something interesting about the official timeline. Chartres Cathedral, supposedly built 1194 to 1220. Amiens Cathedral, supposedly started 1220. Reims Cathedral, major construction 1211 to 1275. And of course Salisbury, built 1220 to 1258. Notice the pattern, they all cluster around 1220. Historians call this the High Gothic building boom, a golden age of cathedral construction when 4 of Europe's greatest cathedrals were supposedly being built simultaneously. So, with all these massive projects happening at once, coordinating hundreds of workers moving tens of thousands of tons of stone, quarrying, transporting, lifting, and carving, we should have extensive records, right? Documentation of how they managed all this. Project logs, payment records, supply chains. The kind of paperwork you'd expect from building projects this massive. Let me show you what we actually have. Chartres, supposedly built 1194 to 1220. The construction records from that period, almost nothing. We have one donation record from 1210, a mention of the dedication ceremony in 1260, and some fragmentary fabric accounts from decades later. The fuller records? Those don't appear until the 14th and 15th centuries, 100 years after the cathedral was supposedly finished. Amiens, supposedly started in 1220. There are no records from the 1220s and 1230s during the major construction phase. The first surviving fabric roll, in 1258, is nearly 40 years after construction supposedly began. Fuller payment records don't appear until the 1260s. And comprehensive documentation, that's from 1288 onwards, after the building was essentially complete. Reims also has no records from the critical early period, and fuller records only appear from the late 1200s. Salisbury supposedly built 1220 to 1258, and here's where it gets remarkable. The first substantial records, the fabric accounts I mentioned earlier, those begin in 1464, over 200 years after the cathedral was supposedly completed. So, the four cathedrals that historians cite when explaining medieval construction methods, the ones they used to estimate Salisbury's workforce and techniques, the reference points for understanding this entire era, none of them have records from the period when construction supposedly began. Chartres' records appear decades after completion. Amiens' records begin 40 years after the start date. Reims' records begin 30 years in. And Salisbury's records begin 2 centuries later, which raises an obvious question. If there are no contemporary records, where do the dates come from? How do historians know these cathedrals were built starting in 1220? And why do they all supposedly start around the exact same time? They use 3 main methods, and when you examine them closely, none of them hold up. Method 1. Architectural style analysis. They look at a building and say this is early Gothic style, pointed arches, flying buttresses, and ribbed vaults. Therefore, it must be from around 1220. Method 2. Historical chronicles. Medieval texts that mention construction dates. And this sounds more solid until you realize most of these chronicles were written 50 to 200 years after the events they claim to describe. That's like someone in 2024 writing about what happened in the 1820s without any primary sources. And it gets worse. Many of these chronicles copied from each other, spreading the same dates through repetition without any independent verification. So you end up with multiple sources all citing the same date, which looks like corroboration, but it's really just one unverified claim being repeated. Method 3. Comparative analysis. They say Chartres has these architectural features. Salisbury has similar features. Therefore, Salisbury must be roughly the same age. This is circular reasoning again. You're dating one cathedral based on another cathedral that was itself dated using the same method. There's no external proof, no independent verification, just buildings being dated based on their similarity to other buildings whose dates are equally uncertain. What if the dates are wrong? What if these cathedrals weren't built in the 1220s at all? What if they were already standing when the medieval church discovered them? What if the church moved into existing structures, made some repairs and modifications, and then claimed to have built them? Think about it. The earliest records we have describe maintenance, modifications, and payments for ongoing work. Just ongoing maintenance of buildings that already existed. What if the year 1220 isn't when construction began, but when the church began documenting their appropriation of structures they didn't build? This is Liber Evidentiarum C. Salisbury Cathedral's own cartulary, their official collection of important documents. According to the cathedral's own archivists, it was compiled chiefly in the latter part of the 13th century. That's 50 to 80 years after the cathedral supposedly began construction in 1220. And what's the earliest construction-related entry? A 1227 charter, 7 years after the supposed start date, mentioning where King Henry III laid the first stone. If construction started in 1220, why is the king laying the first stone in 1227? The next construction reference, 1236, 16 years after the supposed start. A grant of amercements for the fabric of the cathedral. Everything before that, property, revenue agreements, quitclaims, documents establishing ownership of land and rights. Not construction records, not payment to workers, and not contracts with quarries, but documents of possession. You see, the truth is, King Henry III wasn't on site until October 2nd, 1225, 5 years after construction began, and the 1227 laid the first stone charter, written 7 years after the start, may reflect a brief September 1220 appearance. At the peak period of construction, he made no cash gifts to Salisbury's fabric, only timber from royal forests, totaling just £10 in 1228 and 5 marks in 1256 for a night's burial. And a 1251 entry citing a £100 gift to the fabric fund is misleading. It forgave a £100 fine owed by the Bishop of Salisbury. It stated the king was quit from all promises to the fabric fund. This suggests he funded appearances more than the project itself, implying the cathedral was already funded or essentially complete by then. What if 1227 wasn't when construction began, but when the church officially claimed ownership of a building that was already there? Now, before we dismiss this as impossible, let's look at what we know for certain. The church has a documented history of appropriating ancient structures, building on pagan temples, converting existing sacred sites, and claiming ownership of structures they didn't build. From Athens to Rome to Mexico, this isn't controversial. It's established historical fact. We also know the church has rewritten its own history when politically convenient. They excluded inconvenient figures and reframed events to suit contemporary narratives. And we know that advanced technologies have been lost. Roman concrete that outlasted anything medieval Europe could make, the Antikythera mechanism, an analog computer that disappeared for 1,000 years, Damascus steel with properties we still struggle to replicate, and 4th century nanotechnology that we only recently understood. So when we ask, what if medieval Europeans found these cathedrals and claimed them as their own? We're not proposing something unprecedented. We're describing a pattern that has happened repeatedly throughout history. Advanced knowledge lost and existing structures appropriated. Historical narratives rewritten to serve current power structures. The question isn't, is this possible? The question is this what actually happened? So we've done the math, and the timeline doesn't seem to work. The workforce numbers are impossible. Medieval workers would need to be superhuman to achieve what the official story claims. But here's what really keeps me up at night: 4 feet of foundation. That's all Salisbury Cathedral has. 4 feet in waterlogged soil, supporting 70,000 tons of stone for 800 years. Modern skyscrapers drill 50 feet down in similar conditions and still have problems. But this medieval cathedral has been stable for centuries. And then in 2011, a trained mason using modern power tools needed 220 hours to carve one simple cross. Medieval stonemasons. The legendary craftsmen, we're told, had secret knowledge. Supposedly carved thousands of superior pieces using only hand chisels while maintaining an impossible construction pace. Which brings us to the question nobody wants to ask. What if the stonemasons didn't build this at all? What if they found it? What if the secret knowledge of Freemasonry isn't about how to build, but about what they discovered? Next time, in Part 2, the foundations that shouldn't exist, the 2011 cross that exposes everything, and the Freemason connection that explains why they guard their secrets so carefully. So subscribe to my channel, because you won't want to miss this.